Good morning, everybody. Good to see you. Social workers at the National Press Club again. Let's give ourselves a hand. Now, our participation in society and our issues are as important as anybody, and so we like to do this here to show that we are a major portion of this discussion. So it appears that our moderator has not arrived as yet. So we're social workers, all right, and we can do anything if we have to. So we're gonna start this program. First, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors, particularly our platinum and gold sponsors, the Clark Fox Institute at Washington University. Gary Parker is here. And University of Southern California, I don't believe anyone is here from there. The National Association of Social Workers, CEO Dr. Angelo McLean is here. And the Council on Social Work Education, Dr. Dalla Coffey. The Association of Social Work Boards, Dr. Mary Jo Monahan. All right, we'd like to thank, and Barry University also was are the Barry students here? Okay, so today we're going to talk about what we do as social workers in this very, there's so many adjectives we could use to describe this chaotic, precarious, scary political environment that we find ourselves in, with a government that we're not quite sure knows what it's doing in terms of running the country. You know, we're all waiting to see where this is all going. But in the meantime, social workers have to think about what it is that we need to be doing, where do we need to put our focus. And I am particularly interested in young social workers and millennials, because they are the block of voters that will really determine a lot of where the country will be going in the future. And so we do know that many millennials are disillusioned, and they think our system is corrupt. I wonder why. And so they have not participated in our political processes as they may. So we will, and I believe that social workers, young social workers, can be the leaders and the catalysts to, energize that base. And there's no assumption what they're going to do. They tend to be more progressive, but we don't know. But we want them to be involved, because 40 years from now, it's going to be their future, and what they do or don't do now is going to make a difference. So today we're here to talk about what we're going to do as social workers to respond to this political climate. I guess I need to say that I want to thank all the women that are here today. I know it's your day off, but we thank you. Well, somebody say women never take a day off. So, but we want to acknowledge that. And there's so many wonderful people here that I wish I could acknowledge everybody, but you know who that we are really grateful. So we have 4 really exciting panelists today who are going to share their ideas about where we're going. But this is not a panel presentation, okay? They are not just the experts that are going to, give us information. They are going to each has a particular perspective that they can bring to this conversation. But this conversation will also include, we want to include everyone, all right? So we want your ideas, we want your thoughts. There is a microphone to my left, and when you have a question, please go to the microphone. This event is being taped, so we will have this to show to social work students in schools across the country. So this is an important conversation. So I'm going to, if you notice, we have their bios on the back, so we don't have to give you a long introduction. So I'm going to ask, we're going to start from my left with Dr. Linda Lossell Bryant, who is an assistant professor at the Silver School at NYU, New York University. So I'm going to carry this conversation, and if our moderator comes, I will just hand things over to her. But each of our presenters are just going to give you a short statement, and then we're going to begin this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to just acknowledge a level of nervousness. I don't know if it's the room, but my friend Gary Parker here in the audience reminded me that I'm among friends. You're my people. We're social workers. So I'm just affirming that. Thank you. Thank you. So I'd like to begin by saying I'm here representing the Center for Latino Adolescent and Family Health at the New York University Silver School of Social Work. And my focus and my spotlight today will be on Latino issues. But clearly, we're here to talk about the way all of our communities are being affected by the current political climate. So just a couple of thoughts. I think that this is our moment. This is our moment for our profession. With all of the things that we're really concerned about and disturbed by that we're seeing happening, it has galvanized people. It is a wake-up call. And there is an energy that is available to us right now, a momentum that we need to seize, we absolutely need to take advantage of. You know, we have made great strides in the social work profession. We are among the largest group that provides mental health services. We have licensure. These are all incredible strides, but it is time for us to remember the core value of social work practice, which is social justice, and that fight for social justice. So it is a time, I think, to go back to fundamental principles and values, but we do need some roadmaps about what that's actually going to look like in practice. How do we do that? How do we leverage this moment right now? So one, data is absolutely going to be our friend. Okay, we've made strides in terms of research. We need to really get acquainted and make good friends with data. We need to remember that as social workers, we're really nice people. We're nice, but we're not here to make nice. We're here to make change. And we need to embrace that side of our identity. We need to recognize that the political is actually the clinical, because everything that people come to us seeking clinical help for, you can trace its root to some social inequity. So let's recognize that one of the most important clinical contributions we can make is to engage people in the struggle and in the fight for their own justice. You know, we have an opportunity when it comes to Latino communities right now. The demography is on our side. Okay, we know that we are among the largest and the fastest growing populations within the country. In fact, by 2050, it's projected that we will represent 30% of the US population. Okay. There is a big need right now for counter narratives. We are so used to being minoritized. right? We are a minority population. We are an oppressed population. While there may be some truth to that oppression, the side of the story that's not being told is the power that we have right now. Not just in our numbers, our youth and our opportunities right now. We have very real challenges. I don't mean to minimize that for a moment. I couldn't be more aware of those challenges. But there is an opportunity right now. And one of the tasks we have as social workers, I think, is to create counter stories, counter narratives to the dominant story that is out there. The headline is always about how poorly we're faring. And I think we need to shift that headline to, we do have power, there is an opportunity here, you need to get involved, you need to get engaged.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Dr. Suzanne Pritzker, who's an associate professor at the University of Houston Graduate School of Social Work. And she is one of our political social work scholars. Dr. Shannon Lane is also someone who's done a lot of work, but she's also the Coalition for Policy, Education, and Practice Scholar. It's a coalition that has been brought together of social work organizations so that we can begin looking at what our schools are doing and what we are doing in terms of policy, education, and policy practice. And so I'm going to let Dr. Pritzker give a few remarks.
Thank you, Charles. Good morning. I'm thrilled to be here, really excited to get to talk about civic engagement in the Trump era moving forward. I'm going to talk today from really two perspectives. One is that, as Charles mentioned, really much of what I do is focus on researching policy practice and civic engagement, both among social workers and young people. So I'm going to talk a lot from a research perspective today, what we know about civic engagement, particularly among social workers. And then I also teach and train policy practitioners in the Texas context. And I particularly want to make a point about that. There was an article that came out in the Texas Tribune in November, right after the election, that talked about how really what's going on in Texas is a good preview for how politics are likely to work under a unified Republican government in D.C. And so there's a lot that we've seen, a lot of things that may be a little surprising about how unified government works that I want to bring to the table as we move forward from my experience in Texas. So in Texas, in addition to teaching policy courses and researching, I also coordinate several political internship programs, including a block placement where I have 15 students right now at the Texas legislature, living, eating, breathing politics, a lot of politics in the Texas legislature. So I want to come back to that in a little bit. But I want to situate our discussion, really sharing some key findings from some national surveys that I've done both in 2012 and 2016, immediately following the presidential elections, looking at, in both cases, about 1,000 students around the country, what their political participation looks like, so that when we're talking about how to promote civic engagement among social workers, that we have a sense of where our students are today. So first of all, our students are interested in politics. Both in 2012 and 2016, 85% of students in my surveys reported being somewhat or very interested in politics. Over 80% watched a presidential debate. Over 80% watched election returns. I do want to acknowledge there is some self-selection. If you're not interested in politics at all, you might not fill out the survey. But I want to talk about, so even if we are looking at our most engaged folks, these are students who showed pretty consistently to what we've seen in national surveys of social workers generally, very high rates of voting in presidential elections. So, okay, we've got our very engaged social workers. These rates drop substantially when we start talking about down-ballot races. So we go from 95% of my survey saying, oh, I voted for president, to about 60% voting for U.S. representative and other down-ballot races. So even among very engaged social workers, we see a big drop there. Another thing that I want to emphasize is that I think a lot of times we talk about political engagement and we focus on voting. So we see this even in political science literature and other area of research. In the way we talk, we say, you got to go vote, you got to go vote. Well, what about everything else? Because making a difference and influencing policy does involve electing responsive representatives to office, but it also involves continued pressure on them to adopt or reject policy stances once they're in office, right? If we're not doing that, so we've got somebody who's in office who either maybe we like, maybe we don't like, but then what, right? And if they're not feeling pressure from us and continued pressure from us, they're not going to be responsive to us. So I think it's critical that we're making sure that social workers are engaged much beyond the ballot box. And so what we've seen in the research is that engagement most commonly, students are engaged in following and paying attention to political news. Over 90% of the students in my surveys followed news. They researched candidates' stances. Now, how much, how frequently they did this varied, but over 90% said they did this at some point in 2016. But then when we move to expressing or acting on your views publicly, it drops a lot. So about 2/3 of those students expressed political views online in some form in 2016, so that may have just been a little post on Facebook. It could have been more. But then only about 1/3 of students engaged in what I would consider active and committed public-facing political action. So only about 1/3 had protested or marched, demonstrated any sort of candidate support, a little button, a sticker, a sign, anything, I see students with, their Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, whatever stickers on their laptop. That was just about 1/3 of these students. Only about 1/3 attended any sort of political event for a candidate or contacted an official who represents a community. And that one I specifically want to, we talk a lot about you got to call your representatives, but only about 1/3 of these students did that. And less than 20% worked or volunteered for a candidate or political party. So when I look at this data, I see a lot of room for opportunity, a lot of places that we could be involved. But I also want to say this. Social work students do all of these activities at a far greater rate than their other millennial counterparts. Okay? So these numbers to me leave something to be desired, and then I stop and I look. And I look at the research and what we know about other young people. And we have an opportunity here with students who are doing more and are more present in these conversations. And then I want to talk a minute, too, about when we look at what our students are doing, what's happening in our classrooms. So as Charles mentioned, I'm doing some research as part of the Coalition for Policy Education and Practice Scholar. I'm doing research on sort of the state of policy education and social work. We're still in the process of collecting that data, so I don't have all of that, but I want to share a little bit about what we do know. So first of all, for those of you who may not be familiar with this, so social work education has 9 competencies that all of our students must achieve, and one of these required ones is policy practice. So policy practice is, one of the top 9 things we need to make sure that our students are learning. But the forms that that policy education takes vary substantially across programs. We have some programs where there's a little bit of policy tied into a class that covers other content, and there's other programs where students may have 3 dedicated policy classes over the course of their 2-year curriculum in MSW or in their bachelor's program. Some programs are emphasizing sort of, let's learn about current policies, let's learn about the Affordable Care Act, Medicare, Medicaid, or putting that in historical context. And other schools are spending a lot of time on skills, on advocacy skills, for example, on analysis skills. So again, students aren't getting the same thing. It's varying greatly across the country. What also varies is, Charles mentioned Shannon Lane before. Shannon and I did some research where we surveyed field directors across the country. And what we found is that we also vary widely in terms of field opportunities for students to learn to engage with policy. And what we know around civic engagement research is its experiential opportunities that build political engagement skills, right? So at about 50% of programs in this country, some, maybe 1 or 2, with some BSW or MSW foundation students have access to policy practice responsibilities. So that means there's 50% of programs where there's not a single student getting exposure to that in field. And very few of these experiences, even at the schools that do have policy practice responsibilities, involve exposure to elected officials. So our students are not interacting with the elected officials. They may be in advocacy organizations, grassroots, but they're not coming in contact necessarily with elected officials. field instructors talk about this, or field directors talk about this as saying there are real challenges to field-based policy opportunities that I think we need to think about as a profession. Issues around lack of professional social work supervision, but also that students, they're feeling that students don't think this is as important as their clinical training. Why should I want to be a clinical social worker? Why should I spend some time exposed to policy in my field? And then something else that folks talk about as a concern is distance from policy placements. They say, well, we're nowhere near Washington, D.C. We're nowhere near a state capital. And one thing Charles has mentioned that we want to maybe address today is sort of involvement at the state and local level. Well, there is policy happening everywhere in your town, municipalities, in town councils, in county commissions, et cetera. But we're not seeing those as policy options for our students. So if we keep focusing on national level policy and not what's happening in state and local areas, then we're not helping our students gain those skills to be able to impact policy across levels. But CSWA and the Fund for Policy Education Practice have really done a lot of work, I think, in the last year through a recent policy practice and field education initiative to try to respond to some of these challenges. So I'm very hopeful about the opportunities we have moving forward in that regard. And the last thing I want to talk about is come back to the political engagement data that I talked about in the beginning. Initially, and talk about what we're seeing in programs. So when I did my surveys, the surveys of students across the country to see what they were doing, I also asked both students about what was going on in their programs, and in 2012, I asked administrators, deans, directors, what they were doing. So the majority of our students, over 60%, say in both 2012 and 2016 that their programs encourage them to vote, register to vote, and pay attention to election-related issues and news. But just 1/4 of programs sponsored or offered a voter registration drive. So our programs are saying, go vote, go register to vote, but we're not creating opportunities close by for students to do that. Fewer than half of our students report being encouraged to examine election issues deeply or to register others to vote. So they're saying, well, we weren't encouraged to go more deeply into issues, and we weren't encouraged also to do some of what social work talks about, empowering meaningful participation among vulnerable populations, helping other people to be able to have access. 1/3 of administrators in 2012 reported that their programs sponsored or offered discussions around election issues outside of class. So in 2/3 of our programs, there's nothing happening around election issues, discussion of policy outside of class. And again, discussion, being exposed to issues is where students learn to be competent to engage in political action. The final piece of data I want to mention is that how do we influence who is elected, who makes these decisions? We need to be out there volunteering and working on campaigns. Less than 1/4 of our students reported that they were encouraged by their programs to volunteer for a local, state, or federal election campaign. And I don't mean this in a partisan way. I mean at all, nobody said, something that is important for you to do is to consider volunteering for a local campaign. So again, I want to just kind of wrap up here, but mention, I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to really build and strengthen what we're doing around education, both in our core explicit curriculum and in what we do outside of the classroom, what kinds of opportunities are in the classroom so that we can help build civic engagement. There's a lot we know from civic engagement research that I think we need to bring into social work about how we can create programs in create opportunities in the classroom to strengthen political engagement and really move forward in our students and then our future professionals' ability to impact policy.
Thank you, Dr. Briscoe. So our moderator has arrived, and I'm going to give way. April Ryan, who is a veteran White House correspondent. This is your 4th president that she's been a correspondent under. And I mean, we could spend the rest of this conversation just listening to her talk about what's But before our next presenter, Jason Green, I'm going to ask former Congressman Adolphus Ed Towns, to come up and say a few words and introduce our moderator. Let's give him a hand.
Good morning. Let me say that I am excited about all of this. You know, I served in the Congress for 30 years. And of course, we started the Social Work Caucus, then we started CHRIS. And let me just say to you why I think it's important sometimes to share why you are so concerned. I checked, and these is not, and I found out that we had more undertakers in the Congress than social workers elected. And so I felt that it was time to do something. Anytime you have more undertakers than you have social workers. And then, of course, as a result, you know, we put forth an effort to start trying to recruit. Every commencement that I attended, I indicated the fact that I was there to recruit social workers to get involved in the political process. And of course, we have a tendency as social workers to make excuses as to why we don't do. And I'm gonna just say to you, some of the excuses do not make a lot of sense. And I'm gonna say, I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to introduce the speaker. I'm aware of that, but here's a mic. And I said I was involved for 30 years in the political process. But let me just say that, and we make excuses. And, you know, and I've had the opportunity now to follow some of the excuses. You know, to tell me that there was a lady that was on the phone, and of course, she was ironing, and of course, the phone rings, and instead of her putting the phone to her ear, she put the hot iron to her ear. And then, you know, people just don't like to take it responsibility. So anyway, she goes to the doctor. And the doctor said, what happened? She says, well, she says, I was ironing and the phone rang, and instead of me putting the phone to my ear, I put the hot iron. So the doctor looked at the other side, and he says, my goodness, you got a burn over here. What happened? She said, the dummy called back. So we make excuses sometimes, you know, and when you stop and you analyze them, they don't make a lot of sense. And I tell you, the other one that I really was, this was an experience that I had when I was teaching. I'll never forget that this is in elementary school, and this lady brought her son into the class. School started at 8:15. She brought her son to class at 10:15 and gave me a note with a big smile on her face. She says, Mr. Towns, please excuse Johnny's lateness. 8:15 came sooner than I had expected. So these are excuses that sometimes we make, you know, and they don't make a lot of sense. So I'm just so excited about the fact that, you know, we are now beginning to talk more and more about the involvement. You don't have to be involved at the national level. Be involved at the local level. You can be involved with the school board. You can be involved in the city council. You can be involved in the state legislature. You just can be involved, because let me say this to you without any reservation or hesitation. You are more qualified to do the job that we're asked to do than anybody else. Social workers, your training, your background just prepares you to do this job. Now, let me introduce. This person, first of all, she looks young, but she's been around a long, long time. She served under 4 different presidents. And I had the opportunity on one occasion to talk to one of the presidents who knew her very well, said that, you know, when a lot of dumb questions are asked, you know, within the press conference, he said he would turn to April, because April always had a very important question that made sense and that would pull people back in terms of on the track that they should be on. And he said, so when things would get too crazy, he would reach out and then he would point to April and have her to raise the question. You know, so I could go on and on. I could tell you things that you already know, that, you know, she has a book out. You can see that in terms of, she has 2 books out. She has 2 books out, you know. I could tell you that she's a graduate of Morgan State and all of that, you know. Yeah. I could tell you all of that. Yeah, but I figure if I do that, you might applaud, and we don't want any applause. But the point is that She's a person that's committed to making a difference in the lives of people, and I think that is crucial. And let me just say this, and I'm going to sit down. She doesn't believe in artificial facts. Thank you very much. A for Ryan.
She will be signing her book at the end of the program.
Oh, gosh. Thank you, Congressman Towns. He's still my congressman, and I'm going to tell you why he's still my congressman, because he's my cousin. So family, peeps, family. It's true, it's true. We are related. You can see the cheekbones. From way down south in North Carolina, small community, but they put out some good stock. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Yes, we need to have some fire, because we're in a time such as this. I'm not going to say any more. But what I will tell you, I am so thrilled to be here with Congressman Towns in this project that is an outgrowth of his work as a social worker, and I'm thankful for the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy for inviting me today. And one of the reasons why I'm really happy to be here is in my walk as a White House correspondent or as a journalist, I talk to a lot of people. And like the congressman said, people need help. People are hurting out there. And I've talked to people like judges. They feel like, they say that I feel like a social worker from the bench. I hear from so many different people who tell me that they are here to help people. And then look at this, a time such as this. We are now in the post-Obama era. What does that look like? It looks like a time when there's a controversy over what Obamacare did and now what Trump Care could possibly do. There are issues of social justice. There are issues on criminal justice. And who stands for those people? Who are advocates but the social worker? So you are very important today. You were important yesterday, but more so today. This on International Women's Day. How many of you are wearing your red? And if you're not wearing your red, you're walking in spirit, right? Amen. All right. And I'm going to tell you this. The congressman is also, he's a social worker, but he's a preacher too, so he's got stories. He's got a lot of stories, but I thank you guys. Thank you, Congressman Towns. Thank you for inviting me. So I want to go right to this point. And before I go to that point, I want to say something too. And this is a time of activism. We're talking about civic engagement and where does civic engagement and social work meet. And I'm going to give you a story, a true story. A couple of weeks ago, I was in New York. And Harry Belafonte said, come over to my house. I was like, ooh, Harry Belafonte, the day-o man. At 90, I'm like, he still got it. So, so Harry Belafonte, this was right after the election. And this isn't political. This is not a political piece. But this is where the spirit lies, okay? So Harry Belafonte and I were talking, and I said, Mr. Belafonte, I said, I'm talking to so many different people. I said, I look on Facebook right after the election at 4 in the morning. I saw Chris, some of y'all still probably in the fetal position and not telling anybody. So Chris Darden, former O.J. Simpson prosecutor, who's a friend of mine, who's on Facebook, he said, oh, the village clown has now got the keys to the White House. I said, oh, you're going to get in trouble. Black Republican, but he also said this is a time of activism. Then you hear Bob Johnson, the former head of BET, say, we must find common ground. And then in all of this mosh of words, I'm still looking because people are still hurting. And people are trying to figure out where are we going, what's going to happen with this if this happens there. So I asked Kwesi Mfume, the former head of the NAACP and a former congressman, and he says both men are right, we're at a crossroads. So then I said, I'm still confused. So I asked Harry Belafonte, what do you think? He said, this is the greatest time. I was like, what? He said, this is the greatest time. And he said, when he walked with Paul Robeson, and Dr. King, and W.E.B. Du Bois, he said, Du Bois told him this. He said, when there's great pain, and people feel that they've hit rock bottom, it is the time for radical activism. And this is Harry Belafonte. And he said, with that activism, there's great change. So that is why you are here in these seats today. And with that, Jason Green, I'm going to you. You're welcome.
Thank you, April. I appreciate it. And as you look at this panel, I know one of these panelists is not like the other. I mean, I'm not a doctor. We have a lot of doctors up here on the panel, but I'm honored just the same to be here with the former congressman who's just a lion of the Congress. And thank you for all you've done so that we're here, and for our moderator, the esteemed moderator. And thank you to Chris for having me. Forgive me if I'm drinking a lot of water or stumbling through a few words. I'm just getting over the flu. I was worried I wouldn't be able to be with you, but I'm honored to be here. Ms. Ryan just talked a little bit about activism, and we heard about some of the statistics and the data, where we are. I think one of the things that's really exciting about this time is that our activism has the opportunity to take many different shapes and forms. If we're just thinking about how we register people to vote and whether or not they're going to turn out, we've missed the opportunity. Many individuals participated in the Women's March. We have many individuals that are participating today in a day without women. And though I'm not wearing red, I have fire in my heart, and I'm aligned, and there is solidarity there. But there's a whole lot of other activities that are going on. And I want to give you just a little bit of background about some of my work and how I'm going to respond to some of the questions today, sort of the role that I've asked to play. So I was the National Voter Registration Director for the 2008 Obama campaign. And so we can talk about voter registration strategy, but the important takeaway from that experience is that we weren't just trying to register people to vote. We were trying to connect to people where they were to build community, local level, community neighborhood groups, so that they were invested in one another, invested in one another's outcomes. And so when it came time to vote, they were prepared to vote. But beyond voting day, there were neighborhood and community connections that could last on. I served for a number of years in the Obama administration, but post that, I've started a few organizations I think that are relevant to this conversation. The first is a documentary called The Quince Orchard Project. That's a film focusing exclusively on the unlikely merger of three racially segregated churches. Three racially segregated churches from the 1800s. These were the descendants of former slaves and former slave owners that unexpectedly merged their congregations into one in 1968 in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination to be this demonstration of hope and optimism in an otherwise divisive time. That sound familiar at all? You guys know a little bit about some divided times? So what's remarkable about that project and that story is that there's a number of young people, 17, 18, 16-year-olds who are participating in it, and this is their first connection to this idea of community. And they're learning different principles about what's in their neighborhood through film. So we're taking a different approach. I've tricked them. They wanted to participate in a documentary, and instead we taught them about their community. I started a company called SkillSmart. This is a company whose sole mission is to empower individuals and community through jobs. So one of the challenges that we see often is that people don't have the skill sets that they need for the jobs in their community, and they don't know how to get them. They feel a little bit lost. So we help them identify those skill sets from their breadth of their background. I don't care if you learned that skill in a formal setting where you got paid to do it, or in an informal setting when you were an usher in your religious institution. That's a skill set that deserves to be valued and demonstrated in the workforce. And so we help them bring those skills to the table, match to jobs, and then when they're not qualified, we match them to the appropriate training. So again, building that community so that they're being served on their immediate needs, right? This is hierarchy of needs so that they can then participate politically and civically. And then lastly is an organization called the Arena Summit, and this is the newest effort. This was spurred just after the election, where a number of my former campaign and White House colleagues, we felt spurred along by the outcome of the election, and really the discourse of the campaign, frankly. And we realized that for our constitutional society to be strong, we needed to have strong candidates in the arena. We need to have strong political participation. And we realized that across the country, there are people who just felt disconnected. They didn't know where to go or how to engage. And so we started the Arena Summit, which has summits across the country in communities where parties haven't really spent a whole lot of time. We had our first summit weeks after the election in Nashville, Tennessee. We're having our second summit at the end of this month in Raleigh, North Carolina. We'll be in Detroit, we'll be in Las Vegas. We're going to communities that need to be enriched. And what we saw when we sat down with some of the local communities and with the people that are attending these summits is that we wanted people who had integrity. We wanted people who had an understanding of community to run for office, who had an awareness and propensity for social justice, who could not only speak to people and explain to them their consequence in this space, but also their consequence to their neighbors' outcomes in this space. And so what we realized, and what I've really taken away from just the introduction, is that in addition to being engaged in politics, social workers should run for office. And we shouldn't be hesitant about that fact. I take the point, and I think it's an incredibly poignant one, that we should stop focusing simply on our national elections and every 4 years, but to this idea of reaching people where they are. It's social workers that move people in this space, and through their elections, through their campaigns, through their candidacies, will motivate others to get involved. Now, the question that always comes is how and why and when and what. There's a phrase that our moderator knows very well about this town, and that is that we can suffer from paralysis by analysis. The most important step is doing something, right? And the question of whom is you, the answer to that question is you, and the time really is now, where we have this movement of activism, where people want to get engaged, where people want to bring their resources to the table and support. So we really can't worry just about whether or not people are going to register to vote. We, at the same time, have to be just as active and vigilant about whether those voting rights are going to exist, right? We have to meet those challenges where we face them, and I think part of that is stepping into this arena and being truly participatory. Thank you.
And Jason, you're right. Social work is needed on almost every level of society. It touches everything. And we're going to go to Dr. Christy Holmes about social work at this time.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see familiar faces out there. And I think every time you get next to a microphone, I hand sweat every time. I've done this a few times, but it still makes me nervous, even when it's a friendly crowd. I ran for office, and I lost, and it was the best thing I ever did. I went big. I went and ran for Henry Waxman's seat. I hadn't done anything in politics before. It came from teaching a class that was honestly really boring curriculum. And the talk was, why don't you do it? You're graduate students, you're old enough, the requirements are pretty short. Come on, let's go. And they were like, yeah, you go do it. And I was like, oh, I don't want to do it. You go do it. And that's how that started. So I said, well, I'll go to the first meeting thing and see what happens. And there were 25 of us. So I went into it going, well, only one person can win. 25 are going to lose. And that's probably going to be me. So that's good. Okay. So I just went. And I thought I would go for the first couple of bits to see how it goes. Because, you know, teaching and doing are two different things. So I just kept going. It was one of those things that didn't mean for it to keep going, but then I got into the loop, and then there were 15, and just kept going. And it was a really good time. I learned stuff that I probably didn't want to learn. I learned a lot about money in politics. I learned a lot about who supports, about endorsements, and just a lot about money. There's a whole lot about money. So we can care a whole lot, and it doesn't do anything, but you got to find out where your support and influence is. So I don't regret doing that for a minute. I'm not sure I actually wanted the job. I remember at one point talking to Ted. Ted Lieu's the one who eventually won the seat, and we were sitting there waiting for a debate to start, and I said, you know, I figure you're gonna win, but if you don't win, what are you gonna do? Because you had to give up your state seat to run. So if he lost, he lost. And he said, oh, I'll be fine. I'll just go back to the private sector. And I go, wow, that's really interesting. He's like, I can make a difference there too, you know, as we all can. And I like that attitude because, you know, he's doing a great job. I can't be more happy about who won the position. But that means we just have to get out there. And I got a lot of questions that I think were honestly more sexist than against social workers. As far as being qualified to run, I got more of, you know, where are your children? So if your children are around, don't you have a nanny? And if you had your children not around, who watches your children? Like, do you ever see your children? You must be busy. And none of my male counterparts got that. So, and also about qualifications. When it came to the women who were running, we got questions about, honey, why didn't you run for the school board first? And they didn't ask any of the men with the same set of qualifications. So those are the sorts of things that, they can be annoying, but who cares? Just move on. And you can also make jokes like, well, he didn't either. I have more than he does, which I don't, but humor helps. Just keep going. One of the other things I noticed you guys were talking about reminded me of the silo conversation, and I'm getting to hate the word silos, but working in different areas where everybody's doing kind of the same thing but not talking to each other. And I do UN work, and so we've had the Millennium Development Goals, now Sustainable Development Goals, for quite a while. Then we have our 12 problems in social work, and they're very similar, but I wish we'd cross over more. So we can do it in really small ways, even when we're having online conversation with hashtags, global goals with macro SW or something like that, so people can see outside of our discipline that we're working on the same things too. And there aren't many social workers at the UN. It took 6 years, I think, before I met one. And when I was there, they said, oh, so nice to have you. That makes sense you're here, but we don't ever see social workers. And so there's a lot of places for us that we're not right now, and I don't think a lot of our programs are opening the doors there as much as we can. So I think we have a little bit of work to do there. We talked about millennials early on, but I just wanted to remind everybody, millennials are pushing 40s right now, so there is a much younger generation we need to reach out to. And Generation Z is, teenagers, and right now, just a little example, the night before the election, my son right here, Phoenix, who's in the front, he's 10, he was 9 at the time. It was very funny. He and all of his friends, I don't remember being interested in politics, but they were all very into this. And I think that's one of the upsides of this whole divisiveness, because the kids were hearing it at home. And so they all had their opinions, and he was coming home talking about who was canvassing for Bernie and who's canvassing for Hillary. And I was like, this is a really weird conversation to have with a 9-year-old. But he was emotionally invested. The night before, he started making calls for Hillary. He wanted to do that on his own. That's what he had decided. He watched all the debates, and he had what teams were like okay off the Republicans, and he was, why don't we have more on Democrat? And he just saw it from a really basic point of view and how people talk to each other, bullying, lying, certain things that were coming up that he just noticed from a 9-year-old perspective. But one thing I realized I should have done a long time ago was one of my old projects was working on the He for She campaign with a teenager named Rowan Blanchard. She was on Girl Meets World, and now she's turned into a little feminist icon. But she's got about 5 million followers. And so the night before the election, I thought, I should have called her. And so we were trying to cover one of the states for Hillary for getting the vote out. So I called her, and I set up a hangout online so we could sign people up real quick to make calls. And so we covered an entire state in the next 2 hours. And so part of what we need to know as social workers is who we know and who can help influence things. So we got 320 teenagers on the phone doing a get out the vote the night before the election. But we could have been doing something like that all along if we know who we know. So, and they're more enthusiastic than the adults. So just a couple of things. Let's see. Oh, one of the things I make my students do, which they probably don't appreciate very much, but they thank me later. Especially on the online classes. During this semester, I've really been stressing, we talk about these things in policy class and their eyes glaze over a lot of times, but you have to be able to call. So we can't say, come on clients, come on communities, call about this thing, call about that thing, healthcare. And then we won't do it ourselves. And everyone's like, oh, I don't want to do phone calls. I'll tweet, I'll do the email, the online petition, which online petitions are practically, trash anymore. Nobody really pays attention. So you've got to actually pick up the phone. So I make them call right now. And I'm going to watch you. Everyone put your phone on mute, and I make them all call. And also the other thing I'm finding, we have to give some kind of list to them. There's lots of issues, but if you're not politically active, they're not sitting in your head like they are in ours. So, you can give them a few things to call about. I don't care if you call for or against, or just call your congressperson and thank them for doing a great job because you're representing me well. But you've got to pick up the phone and talk to somebody. So they do that, then it makes a huge difference. All of a sudden, they've called every week for the last 6 or 7 weeks on their own. So just making them do that first time is important. Talking about it is not the same as doing it. And once you do it, it's easier. The other thing that we have to do along with that is translating for communities. So we talk about all these things, again, in our jargon and language, and especially when it comes to the healthcare stuff. Now I care about healthcare, for those of you that know. I had a really big medical incident in the last year. Barely made it, but I'm here. But I had good insurance. I'm pretty sure if I didn't have good insurance, I'd be dead. So if these things went through and lifetime caps happened, so I'm all passionate about this now because I know what it feels like to sit there and go and see other people in the hospital who don't get it, or see the nurses say, yeah, you know what happened there? You know, they didn't get approved for a transplant. I was like, okay, so people that get this letter that say you're approved for transplant, I got that, it was supposed to be good news. Other people get the one that says you're not. And it's like crickets. Why would I get it and somebody else want it? So there, my social work self was getting really stressed out in the hospital. They had to give me some pills for that because I was getting very upset, calling everybody in there saying, well, how does this work? Who do you call? They're like, you need to calm down. You're in ICU. I'm like, yeah, but I just don't understand how someone could get turned down for the same thing that I can get. And that's before any of this was happening. So find the thing that drives you. This wasn't my thing a year ago. I wasn't even thinking about these things. But right now, healthcare should drive everybody because that might be you at any point. So anyway, I think I covered my points. I was trying to not recover what everybody else did. Yeah. But thank you so much for having me.
And you did a magnificent job with it. You did a magnificent job. But you said something very important, Dr. Holmes. You said, you talked about our children. I have a 14-year-old and a 9-year-old. How many of you have kids in here? My kids, if my kids are like yours, they were so involved in the election process. And I think part of the problem and the greatness is the device. I remember as a kid, my mother would never put a $200 or $300 anything in my hand at that age. But they are so connected to the world now, and they see what's going on today in 2017 because of the advances of technology, and it makes us more engaged, whereas, again, social work, activism. But, you know, this isn't a new thing. Activism is not a new thing. And keeping in the spirit of International Women's Day, I'm going to go way back in history. There was a woman who said she freed 1,000 slaves, and she could have freed thousands more if they only knew they were slaves. She was addressing the dis-ease at the time. That was Harriet Tubman. She was somewhat of a social worker. She moved them from the South to the North as everybody was looking for them. That's social work, that's activism. Then you think about, what's wrong, cousin?
Somebody said she was a travel agent.
All right, Ben Carson now, let's not go there. All right. All right now. Let's get the history straight, all right? But let's go back. Y'all gonna get me in trouble in here. Let's go back, and it's online too, okay? And he did apologize though, so, but we're not gonna ask you to apologize, but it's all right. But let's even go to 1972, to Shirley Chisholm. Let's go to the first black woman who ran for president, Congressman Towns' mentor. She said, if there's not a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. So that's saying I need to be in the process, active. So with all this history of not even, before Shirley Chisholm, when, Harriet Tubman started moving people because of the disease, they didn't call it social work, and they didn't call it activism. It's about this dis-ease in the spirit. So with all of this knowledge about the dis-ease of the spirit from years ago and bringing it forward to today, March 2017, Dr. Bryant, how do we view today activism and social work? And I'm asking each one of the panelists that go down the line, what is the cross? How do we function today with activism and civic engagement? What should we do?
So, we talked a little bit about what it looks like at the academic level, right? In the curriculum, and how do we get our students more involved? And, one of the downsides of those devices is that young people have access to so much information, but they need help making sense of it. I've spoken to my classes. I work with undergrads at NYU, and they talk about shutting down because it's just too much, like not knowing where to start, okay? So let's not assume that because people have access to the information, they know how to organize it, and then what steps to take.
And I'm going to give a caveat to
Yeah.
that. And make sure it's not fake news. Look at the source. No, seriously, you're absolutely right, because it's a bombardment of information. You're absolutely right. And some of the headlines are crazy, and you have to look at where it's coming from. Credible sources. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
At the same time, we know that there's this tremendous power in social media. And I think that's a power we haven't yet figured out how to leverage enough, as powerful as it is. I always use the example of the ice bucket challenge, when people were just running around dumping buckets of ice on their head, right? They're not even sure if they knew why they were doing that, but it caught on like wildfire. So I looked at that and I thought, wow, this is a community organizing tool, right? We're not using it in that way enough, but it's something we could. If we can get people across the country dumping buckets of ice on their head, right, which is without a real tangible result, what could we do with that medium to get people to get involved locally, to even to spread the information about taking all of these issues that are out there and communicate to folks, pick one, pick two that really are important to you and close to your heart, and go for it, right? Here are places you can call to find out. Here's a website you can look up to get more information about how to do that. So there is a need for us to get back to our organizing roots and think about how are we going to organize people. They are fired up. They're in distress. They're ready. They're kind of like, I'm ready to go. Where am I going? What is step number one? And so I think that's our challenge. That's one of our key challenges as social workers, which is to help the people we serve figure out how do they make sense of this morass of information and challenges that we face, and to break it down into what's step one, what's step two, help them partialize it in a way that it's digestible and they can actually begin to take some concrete steps. I think the other key thing for us as a profession is that we do need to occupy territory. We need, in addition to wherever we already work as social workers, whatever it is we do, recognizing that leadership is not just about the person who's got the corner office or has the title or has the letters after their name. Leadership is about pursuing a goal. It's not the role per se. And we conflate those things. We think leadership means it's the person who's got the official responsibility, okay? But we are living in a time where, like, we have people who have the title, they have the role, they're not exercising leadership. So we must. So in whatever we're doing right now, whatever organizations we're serving, and how are we taking steps to organize the problem, conceptualize it in ways that people can understand, and to direct, to help direct, right? How are we harnessing that energy? You talked a little bit about running for office. I can certainly understand in these times why folks wouldn't want to run for office, right? Any more than you'd want to just be under a microscope all the time. But we do need to occupy roles that we don't traditionally occupy. We've gotten a little bit comfortable with our success as a profession. And I feel like that might be a controversial thing to say, but we have gotten a little comfortable. And we need to get out of our comfort zones. And in addition to whatever we're doing to make a living, we have to do these things that we're saying we need everyone else to do. We want our students, I ask all of our students, do you know who your elected representative is? Yours, based on where you live, who are your elected officials? They don't know, so we start there. Like, your homework is, you're gonna do some research, you're gonna find out who your elected representatives are. Then you're going to either email them, write them, call them, you're gonna make contact with them. We don't teach civics in schools anymore, okay? And that has served some people well. It's part of why we are where we are. But bringing back civic education for us to use our relationships with people to inform them and inspire them to take those actions is something that we can definitely do.
Thanks, Dr. Bryant. You made a very good point on a lot of your pieces, but there's one thing. How many of you remember the Ice Bucket Challenge? There was a dollar amount linked to it to go to a charity. and a cause. Do you remember the cause? Good, because a lot of people forgot that and they weren't giving to it, they were just doing it and it was going viral. So yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And I'm gonna go to Dr. Pritzker. Talk to me about what you think in 2017 civic engagement and social work should look like. And before you do that, if you have questions, please line up at the microphone because we're gonna start answering questions very soon. Yes, Dr.
Well, first I want to echo everything that Linda said and kind of reinforce the need for us social workers across the board to be engaged in activism, to be running for office, all of that. But I want to go kind of to some things that I think, speaking particularly from both my teaching hat, but also the Texas context. So first of all, we need to truly bring policy alive for our students, for social workers. That policy is not separate from clinical social work. All social work is political, and in order to help our clients, this is an integral way. Politics is an integral way of how we help our clients. Something I do the first day of foundation policy every semester is I pull up Section 6 of the Code of Ethics, right? And I put up the language that specifically talks about our ethical principles regarding political action, and I bold this, and we talk about it, and I stop and say, first of all, how many of you knew this was what you were getting into? And about 2 students in my class of 30 will raise their hands, right? And then we talk about this, and we set the stage from day one that everything you are about to learn in the rest of your program and everything you are about to do in the rest of your career involves and incorporates political action, that this is integral to this. And I think we need to be clearer about this. I mentioned before the research with field directors where students said this is getting in the way of my practice. I don't want to see us doing that. Social work with civic engagement, it has to go hand in hand. This isn't getting in the way of clinical practice. This is essential to clinical practice and helping our clients. So the second thing that I want to emphasize is something, and this really is kind of coming from the Texas context and moving forward. I think one of the things that we really struggle with as social workers in terms of how we engage is that we're often not open to finding common ground with folks that share different values. We're not so good about engaging with political diversity as much as we are maybe around some other areas of diversity. One of the things I mentioned, I run this legislative internship program, and when I send my students out there, one of the first things they talk about is how scared they are to talk to any Republicans. They're literally scared. I send them to networking events, and they write on these personal reflections, each of them separately. I didn't want to talk to anybody in the room because I don't know how to talk to people I disagree with. What we've seen in Texas is you have to, in a state where there are not enough Democrats to influence policy at all, you have got to find people that you can find common ground with. You don't have to agree with everything they're doing, but you've got to find something. So yesterday, the Texas Senate heard 20 hours of testimony on the bathroom bill that's being proposed in Texas that's mandating people use the bathroom matching their birth gender. Passed 8-1 out of the Senate committee to do this. So, right, you go in there and you think, it doesn't matter what I do. This is going to become law in Texas. Well, let me tell you what. Now that bill is going to go to the floor of the Senate, it's going to pass, and then it's going to go over to the House. Our Republican Speaker of the House does not want this bill to go forward. He is going to find a way to kill that bill. Okay? That is an ally with the Republican Speaker of the House. Okay? Last week, there was a bill, there is major reform to kinship care, to expanding kinship care support for family caregivers in the foster care system. Major reform going on, very bipartisan reform, and a Republican member of the House proposed an amendment that would deny kinship support to families with undocumented members in it. Democrats and Republican legislators worked together to kill that amendment because they didn't want to undermine support for kinship care, increase support for family members caring for children in the state. That is examples of Republicans and Democrats being important partners working together. And I feel like a lot of times in our rhetoric, we really struggle with this. We struggle with where we can find common ground and work for it, and we have to do it when there is unified one-party control. We have to be able to work with folks across difference. And the third thing that I want to emphasize is I think it is great that we are seeing a resurgence of activism. It's great that we're seeing, and I hope we continue to see a lot more civic engagement. But we also, in order to truly influence policy, we need to have more attention to strategy. We really need to make sure that we are training our students not just to make those phone calls and write those letters, but to really think big picture on how to think strategically about advocacy, and to take leadership roles in helping others to do so. One of my favorite stories out of Texas is one of our alums, is executive director of an abortion rights fund, the Lil Fund in Texas. And during the interim, so Texas meets every other year for 5 months, the legislative session, so the interim is the time in between. She and her board members went to go get concealed handgun licenses. They went to the gun range to get their training. These are not folks who had ever done this before, right? 30 years, they don't have gun permits. Why did they do that? Because at the Texas legislature, there's a separate line you could go in if you have a concealed handgun license, and you get in faster. And they wanted to make sure when there were bills coming before the legislature, and the legislature was going to act quickly, because they often do that, oh, here's a vote, let's go. They wanted to make sure they could run into the Capitol and be there to testify. That was thinking ahead, making sure they weren't just there when they heard the bill was coming, but that they were thinking ahead of time, how can we most strategically make sure we are there when we need to be there? And so I absolutely want to see this resurgence of activism, but I want to pair it with educating, particularly our students who are in macro concentration, going to be policy practitioners, making sure they are thinking about strategy and really thinking about how do we make sure we're really going to make a difference, not just being a lot of active voices, but really being able to make a difference and impact policy directly.
All right, Dr. Pritzker, thank you. And let's go to Jason. Jason, what does it look like today, the crossroads between activism and social work?
Well, I think, so you already heard my plea to run for office, and I'll come back to that sort of when we wrap up, because I think it's something that we absolutely should do. But picking up on Dr. Pritzker's point about sort of this idea of strategy, I think what is so important, whether it's in an elected capacity or appointed capacity or heightened political engagement capacity, is that we show up. There has to be intentionality around that point. We can cut the 2016 election a whole lot of different ways, but one of the challenges was that we didn't show up and fight everywhere. And these issues, these communities, these ideologies are worth fighting for. And the conversation that Dr. Pritzker was just talking about, this conversation amongst an ideological divide, you don't disagree with people, you disagree with ideas. And so it's fundamentally important that you be there to be a countermeasure to those ideas. And what we find is that it's those personal connections. It's knowing that someone had a healthcare challenge. That's what moves me about this idea, this issue. It's knowing someone in a family or a loved one that is LGBT that's going to move that issue. It's those personal connections. It's those personal narratives. It's those personal stories. And so we can't assume for a second that the outcome is already predetermined. It's essential that we participate. It's essential that we engage, because we also don't know who you might inspire with your story. And so as you teach, as you engage in the academy and on the clinical side, I'm reminded, we did a little bit of history. I'm reminded of a woman in Montgomery, Alabama, in March, this month, 1955, who was one of the inspirations for the bus boycott. Now, who do you think I'm talking about? You think I'm talking about Rosa Parks? I'm talking about Claudette Colvin. Right? So those in the room who know Claudette Colvin's story, a few weeks before Rosa Parks was arrested, Claudette Colvin, who was 15 years old, was inspired by the story she heard in her civics class that day, because someone thought it necessary. In a divided country, right, where these rights were not afforded to this class of people, someone still thought it important to talk about that, still thought it important to talk about one's constitutional rights, still thought it important to talk about the role of community engagement, and she heard that message. And so that day, riding home on the bus, she decided not to give up her seat. And Ms. Parks talks about that as one of her inspirations when they were being very strategic about the outcome of that bus boycott. She talks about that 15-year-old student, Claudette Colvin, who was inspired by her teacher to exercise her civil rights. And so I think that's so important that we don't know exactly which story is going to move someone, but we need to be intentional about the stories that you're going to carry. We talked about being connected, but not being educated. And you all have the wonderful position of being trusted purveyors of information, where you are that trusted source of information. So the activity might fall on you to understand and be that clearinghouse of what's going on out there, but then to provide that information to your students and to your community so that they can hear your words and be so inspired to go do good deeds. I think that that's where one of the places where we need to be really active and intentional.
Yeah. Dr. Holmes?
Well, April, first, thank you for bringing up the fake news part of what we have to do while we're trying to educate.
And I'm not one of them, but go ahead.
You are not. One of my basic points in class right now, and we have to start where we're at. I have 5 sections of students. That's who gets my advice most of the time, or my opinion, honestly. You know, you try to hide it, but it comes out. But sometimes you just have to say, okay, stop using this, that, the other as your reference point. I've started to just wind way back, and I'll tell you all here, just like I tell all my students, you need to be on Twitter. You really, really, really need to be on Twitter. If you're like, I don't have time for Twitter, Facebook is a morass of you-know-what right now. So you can use that for family and friends to try to help correct messages. Right now, I'm trying to just do things where I dialed back into just screenshotting Mr. Trump's tweets. So instead of sharing an article of someone that I agree with this, look at this, and it's usually headlines or all people are reading, or that first couple of lines under the headline, show them what the man is saying, show them what they're doing, or it's direct from the person who's saying it. So on Twitter, people write what they think as they think it. It's not always the best way, and sometimes I write things that I probably shouldn't write when I think it, but it's coming directly from them. So rather than having an argument back and forth about interpretation, is this okay? And I've noticed the arguments have reduced greatly when I just post a screenshot of a tweet or something somebody directly said, because you can argue about the meaning, but you can see what was said. And it's really hard right now to sort through the fake news. The other part of it is on Twitter, you find reporters that you trust. I trust this person to tell me the truth. So I did. I followed you.
Okay,
I
good.
followed you immediately.
Give me
Yeah.
5. Yeah.
Immediately.
April
yes.
D. Ryan, that's the handle, yes.
April D. Find me on Twitter. That's right. Oh, I just love that scene. I've watched I showed it in class too.
Oh my goodness, let's not even go there.
That's
That's,
I
yeah.
just can't even.
That'll take a whole other couple hours, but go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, my sideways notes here. All right, so social media, there's 1 million, almost 1 million of us professional social workers in the United States, and I love that Suzanne brought up the 6.04, because that's what I use, and it's buried at the bottom of our code of ethics, and I think most social workers might have seen it once in school and never look at it again, but it's not like kind of part where we're interpreting it as part of our ethical duty. It is part of our ethical duty, and it's really clear on who we're supposed to be defending and advocating for. Everyone's listed. Everything you can think of is listed there. I'm impressed with how much is listed there. So go revisit that if you haven't and break down those bits. You can't do all of it all the time, but focus. Like I said, pick a couple of things that you care about. Discomfort is part of our code. I'll say that again. Discomfort is part of our code. If you're comfortable all the time, you're not doing the right thing. Because if you're always comfortable, you think you know what you're talking about, you think everybody understands what you're talking about, they don't. So be uncomfortable in what you're doing. You know, it's okay to be comfortable most of the time, but find something that's challenging to you, meet someone new, find out somebody else's story that you're not familiar with. It'll make you more effective as a social worker and as an advocate. All right, know your weaknesses in your group. I noticed that in some of the marches, because I love advocacy, I love marches, but have you noticed what happens in the news right now? The second they find somebody with any kind of weakness, they exploit only the weakness, and the story becomes about the weakness. And so know your weaknesses before you go in, so that you have something to come back with, and it's not just out there. You don't want to get discredited as soon as you get out there. So make sure that your group, whoever you got, and I'm not talking about extreme vetting, I'm just talking about Google. Just know what's out there, and it doesn't mean the person can't lead, it just means you know what's there, and you can deal with it as you go. So it's a pretty powerful tool for good and evil these days. All right, I think that's really all I have, because you all covered it so well. So please, social media, please, Twitter.
Yeah, and I see some of you, I'm following Twitter right now, some of you are tweeting, so please break the Twitter this morning. Let's hashtag, what's a good hashtag for this moment?
Macro SW is our ongoing, it's macro social work, so macro SW or just social work. Yeah,
For this event.
we didn't do one for this
Okay,
event,
well,
so it's ongoing.
let's do something, hashtag social work.
Yeah.
Let's just hashtag social work today.
Yeah.
Hashtag, go on Twitter right now, hashtag social work. And do we have the website link? And put the website.
It's
Yeah,
on Facebook.
This is actually going live right now because we need to let people know the importance of what's being said today. And as we have the importance of today, and we're talking about social media, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, and Facebook, you see a lot of the fake news more so on Facebook. Be very leery. Watch the titles and watch who it's coming from, what organization it's coming from, and also watch to see the journalist that's putting it out.
Yes.
Be very, very careful. And you've got a lot of issues today. Just today alone, we've got advocacy on issues of the high price of prescription drugs. Congressman Elijah Cummings finally has his meeting with the president today at 2:30. We've got ACA that CBO did not score, that's being passed and pushed around in Congress now. We've got the travel ban issue right now. We've got so many voting rights. There's so many things on the table just today. And you saw a couple of women the day after the inauguration walking around in places. Just the day after, just a couple of women were walking around in London, New York, DC, and size does matter. People paid attention. People paid attention. And with that, yes, ma'am, in the pink. Let's go to your question.
Good morning. My name is Deborah Warford, and I'm blessed to be a baby boomer, social worker in the millennium world, and I start graduate school this year at the age of 61. So I'm blessed to know. And so I grew up during the era of the civil rights, so you know that civic engagement and civil learning in school was so important, and I'm so sorry that we don't have that anymore. But as a social worker, I always thought that all we did was like food stamps and housing issues. But if it wasn't for the University of Connecticut, I just want to shout them out, that let me know that I can be a political social worker with the passion that I have. And that's what's not being taught in historical black colleges. Coppin State in the house. But I just want you to let people understand that one of the things we need to educate people on is that electoral vote. That's how Trump was able to win. We're not teaching that to our students. We're not teaching that. Even to the baby boomers do not know. So I just want us as social workers to, first of all, accurate information that we give out, become more engaged, and to find out where you can make a difference. And that's what's not being taught in the schools, where we can make a difference. You know, we're being pushed to be clinical social workers. Everybody's not meant to be clinical. Everybody's not meant to be a clinical social worker. So I'm just saying that, first of all, thank you for saying everything that's been on my heart for the last year or so. I just want to know, how can I start making a difference? I am looking for employment too, so if you can find me something in the political arena, I appreciate it. You know, public service announcement. But again, thank you so much for letting me know that I do have a role and that everything I've been saying is not false in my mind, and that we really need to push the idea of not only voter registration, but educating the correct information. So thank you so much for understanding me as a baby boomer in a millennium world. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone like to address?
Let you say the substance. One of the things I think is so critical about what you're talking about is that we not think of social work just as a profession. Social work is a profession, it's a laudable, notable profession, but it's also an ideology. And when we think about that as an ideology with the core principles that we've heard discussed up here, that is no longer bounded by occupation. So if what you care about is positive outcomes in social justice, in community, to increase integrity across the landscape, then you're not bounded by an occupation and how you deliver those outcomes. You can do that as a social worker, quote unquote, in the profession. You can do that as a teacher outside of the profession. You can do that as a film producer, as a business developer. You take those core principles, and in whatever enterprise you pursue, you're able to deliver that to the community that you're serving. And I think that's really important in the way that we teach social workers, that they should, if clinical social work is the place for you, you're wonderful. But if your passions are elsewhere, that you don't leave those social work ideologies at that doorstep, that you bring them with them, and you're so much more effective because you bring that with you.
And I want to thank you very much for your comments, and I'm really thrilled to hear of your interest in political social work. But I want to piggyback off your comment about the lack of civics education. This is very real. Okay, this has been declining for a while, but I think particularly actually in the advent of No Child Left Behind, it pushed for more testing on reading, more testing on math, not on social studies. And what happens in the classroom when we're not tested on it, we're not learning it. And so we have seen a real decline in what our students are learning when it comes to social studies and civics. And I think one of the things that those of us who are social work educators need to realize is our students are coming in the door without basic civics knowledge. And even when, like, I teach in a graduate program, I need to realize that my students don't even have undergraduate level civics knowledge, and this has got to be part of our responsibility to teach that, to fill that gap if we want civically engaged students. And the research is very consistent on this. In order to be politically engaged, people need civic knowledge and skills. That's what civic education, civic instruction is. So we really need to be teaching our students. We kind of actually, going back to the previous question, we can't jump to how do you influence, how do you get engaged in activism if we haven't taught them how systems work, if they don't know that the presidential election was decided on electoral college and not on a popular vote. If they don't know, one of the things I'm always struck by is that, for example, I've had students literally in my classroom say, under the previous administration, there's consistently potholes on my street. Well, I called the White House to complain about this. And I would say to them, President Obama does a lot of wonderful things. I just don't think he cares about your potholes. I mean, I'm sure he cares, but he's not going to do anything about it. But our students are coming in not knowing who is responsible, where do I go, who do I blame, who do I go to, who do I advocate to. So I think we really need to be mindful of the lack of civic engagement and figure out how we can better address that as we're trying to channel that into advocacy and activism.
So let me ask you this. When we talk about advocacy and activism in civics classes, and the civics classes not being in the schools anymore, what happens then? Do we just walk away and just say, okay, the onus is on the schools? Or do we as parents or leaders or role models for kids take them to the polls and show them? Because, I mean, I was a kid, when my parents went to the polls, we were behind them. This is a time when you close the curtain and you click the little things. I remember that. I remember hearing that curtain close. And I followed the steps of my parents. My kids are watching the news because I'm in the news and watch it in the mornings before I get them up to go to school. So, I mean, but what if the schoolhouse is not doing it? Do we take it to our house? What happens there?
I think we need to remember that a lot of parents are also not engaged and don't have that expertise to do that. So, I have twin 4-year-olds, and they're growing up around a mom who lives, eats, breathes this, right? So they have opinions about presidential candidates, and they want to know all about, they have lots of opinions about these things, and they're growing up with that. But not everybody has that household that has that focus and has that knowledge. So I think that we really need to think about it. And maybe this is a place as social workers, if it isn't happening in the schools and it isn't happening at home, can our community organizations, are there things that we can do with youth serving organizations in the communities, for example, youth development? Can we think about how do we incorporate some of that civics in there? And there are great programs around the country that are engaging young people and teaching them civic skills and helping to empower them and bringing them into going and speaking to their city council, but giving them the skills to do that beforehand. And I think those are things that we, as social workers, when we're working in communities, can do a lot more and pay a lot more attention to in order to sort of fill this gap.
Thank you. I see the tweets. Keep tweeting, keep tweeting. Next question.
Hi. I am Denise Davison. I am an assistant professor at Morgan State University.
Fair Morgan. Yes.
And also another graduate of another HBCU, and I want to raise them up, and that's Clark Atlanta University.
All right.
I also want to raise up the National Association of Black Social Workers. I serve as a national relations co-chair for them. And the reason why I say that in particular is because ever since I've been a social worker for many years, we've been dealing with this identity crisis, and that's what I'm listening to. We're still trying to figure out who we are and what we do and how we should be doing it. And we continue with that conversation. If we go back historically, I was so glad to hear Shirley Chisholm and Harriet Tubman and Claudette Colvin raised, because if we go back in history, we will see that African Americans traditionally came into the field of social work around social justice. We never lost that fight. In urban communities, in our HBCUs, we always know you have to fight the personal and the political simultaneously. And so I'm always really like amazed and bewildered why we're still having this either or conversation and not this collective whole conversation about how are we more inclusive and how do we actually transform communities and not just patch up people and send them back into those communities. How can we actually transform them? And so as I listen to you, and Jason, that was what you last year, so thank you again for coming back. I think these discussions are real important, but if we really want to make a difference, we got to do something a little bit differently. Even these new grand challenges that we've come up with, where is the voice of the urban community? Where is the voice of the historic leadership in indigenous communities? Where is it? It's like missing. And to that point, I do want to say that at Morgan State University in the School of Social Work, where Dean Anna McFadden is our leader, we have a program called the Urban Women on the Rise Leadership Program that was funded to actually develop women, African American women, as leaders, to position them for leadership in the field of social work and to deal with advocacy issues and to deal with political issues and to deal with this holistic way of doing social work. How can we expand stuff like that? How can we get the broader, big organizations within our social work field to take that on? Because women have more than just, we're more than just supporters for everybody else's stuff, their dreams. So I'm going to back up from that.
You unpacked a lot.
Yes.
You got a couple people. I think Dr. Bryant wants to take it. You wanted to take it too?
Thank you so much for sharing that. I've got a million things running through my head. You know, I mentioned before that I was concerned that maybe as a profession we've gotten a little comfortable. And that's not because we just wanted to rest on our laurels. I think we have put so much energy into trying to help people cope and navigate systems that are so broken and so oppressive. And that's taken a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of skill to do that. But if we were looking at people in a ditch, right, we may have to get some food down there to the ditch. We might have to get some resources down to the ditch, but ultimately our commitment is people shouldn't be in a ditch, right? We have to pull you out of there, and we have to fight whatever systems allow that to happen in the first place, right? So it's a lot on us. It's a tremendous amount, but that's the calling. That's the call. Social work, you know, to your point, is not just what we do, it's who we are. So that's the commitment. I also want to use the R word here and talk a little bit about race. And the fact that, you know, blacks and Latinos need to come together, okay? We keep fighting this, you know, We need to come together. There's a lot we were able to do in the 60s because there was more unity. So going back to looking at what are some of those historic models, right? Where did we break some of this down and make some progress? But we do need to come together, recognizing that neither of our communities are monolithic, right? There's tremendous, we can't say like, this is what it means to be Black and this is what it means to be Latino, but we know on the whole, both are hurting tremendously.
Yeah.
So what would happen if we did join forces? And we've got to take some risks in doing that. Think of the power we have collectively to do that.
And we have a few minutes left, and I want to go to, I hope she answered it. Okay, thanks. Sorry. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left, and we're going to go to the next question, and then we're going to kind of wrap up. But I will say this, to your point, African Americans and our Latino brothers and sisters have some of the highest negatives in almost every category to this day. So activism, solutions, there's a need there. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Margot Aronson, and I am with the Clinical Social Work Association. So, first of all, I am not a baby boomer. I am from the silent generation. Social workers never stop. You remember who the silent generation is. We're older than the boomers.
Your wisdom, your wisdom.
So, the reason the clinical social workers do so much of the mental health work in the United States, and the reason that we're so good at it, is because we're social workers and we get it. Social work is the base. And one of the things that is really, really important in the Clinical Association and also NASW work on is that clinical social workers are an important part of the social justice team. And what we focus on is mental health, the mental health reforms, what do those laws say, what are the details, what page, what line needs to be changed on what page in this bill. We can go and tell the staffers, we get really down to it. And also, the entire criminal justice system is hugely involved in mental health. The issues of mental health are usually involved in the criminal justice problems throughout. So there is a great need for clinical social workers to be involved and for social justice non-clinical social workers to keep involving us. So I just want that message to be that clinical social workers aren't just sitting over there doing their private practice. Many of us spent years in public service and ended up maybe in private practice, maybe started in private practice, but there's a real responsibility there.
You are definitely needed. You are definitely needed. Thank you. And I'm going to go to the next two questions really fast. Come one behind the other because we're really supposed to be over. And then I'm sorry, and then after that I have a book signing. So come and get the book because it's talking about activism and women. Okay, yes.
All right, I don't want to take time away from your book signing.
Okay.
Sure.
No, go right ahead.
No, I don't really know what I want to say. My name is Christine, and Christine Lucas. I have been a public health analyst with the government, with CDC, for a very long time, so I know data really well. But more importantly, I'm a PhD student right now. I'm in my second year, and I've been writing a lot about issues that concern me. One, transgender issues, and another, the global gag rule, which I really feel very strongly about. What I'm not doing, but now I am completely fired up to do because of you all, you wouldn't believe the notes I've taken, is I've got to do this publicly. So I'm going to start writing sort of advocacy pieces on all of these issues because I don't see social work doing it. And it really disappoints me. As much as I've reviewed the literature and gone through whatever I can go through, I'm not seeing social workers writing in a strong, fierce voice about some of these issues, in particular the transgender issue. So I am so fired up.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank everybody for giving me sort of a boost.
Amen. Thank you. And I think there was we're just going to do real fast. Were you standing up? Come on, no, come on. We're going to get through this. Come on. You got to activate for yourself now. Come on. There she goes. She's fine. And then we're going to have the gentleman, and we're going to close it out.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I'll try and not take up much time. I was trying to formulate my question, really get to the heart at it. Thank you to all the panelists and for moderating as well. And I was really, really struck by some of your comments about the need for us to challenge ourselves, to step out of our comfort zone. I'm a clinical social worker from Boston, and I've spent the last 4 to 5 years working internationally and just returned to the US last fall, moved to DC 5 weeks ago. And I'm really concerned about the fraying of our social fabric, for lack of a better term, and the differences in values that I see now just within my own country. I mean, don't even get me started on the rest of the world, but here, and I think that as social workers, yes, there's a place and time for advocacy, for protest, for voter registration, for serving in political office, but I see a need for us to have some really hard and difficult conversations with people who do not share our values in this profession. And I don't have any responses really, but this is my question of how can I step out of my comfort zone and work with all of you to do this. Thank you.
You stepped out of your comfort zone by getting up and asking that question. Yes, you did. Yeah. Really fast, to answer really fast.
One thing I can say directly to you, and thank you for just getting up and saying it. Doesn't even matter what you said, you got up. So it takes a lot of practice, and like I said at the beginning of this, my hands still sweat every time I get in front of a microphone, even though I'm in front of a microphone a lot. You just have to just keep doing it anyway, and your heart comes through. You know, what you're wanting to say will eventually get there, and I just want to see more of us, and today crosses over really well with Women's Day, International Women's Day, and a lot of times we're apologizing for our presence sometimes, apologizing for not saying the right thing, not being quick enough, being in the way, sitting at the table. So stop saying I'm sorry so much and just start speaking up. Your
Walk
voice
boldly.
is just as valid. Yeah, your voice is just as valid. So wearing red sometimes helps. Today's a good day for red, so go get a red scarf. Give yourself some empowerment. But if we stay at the rate we're at right now, females in particular, will stay at 17%, whether it's Congress, on boards, the rest of it, for the next 100 to 500 years. So we can keep saying, oh, we're doing better. It's the most women ever in the Senate, but it's still not enough. So we've got to make bolder steps. We have to write in blogs, not just try to do social work research, which research is great, but if it doesn't translate to the community, we're failing. So we do have to use our voice on Twitter. We have to use
And
our
that
voice
op-ed
on
piece,
blogs.
the lady who just came up, the op-ed piece, writing, yeah.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's it. That's all I have to say.
All right, thanks. Yes, sir.
Good morning. Sam Odom, Southern University School of Social Work, New Orleans, Louisiana. And this couldn't have happened at a more opportune time, considering that March is National Social Work Month. What struck me specifically, some comments that were made around who is a social worker and what is it that social workers do. I think for us that are in the room that are social workers, make no mistake about it. If you do not have the training, and what I mean by the training, that is a bachelor's degree in social work, an MSW degree, Master of Social Work, or a DSW or PhD, you're not a social worker. And I say this often to my students because for a long time, historically, I think our profession has always been one that has been encroached upon. And so I think for the record, understand that training is what separates those who are pseudo-social workers as opposed to those who are actually trained social workers. My comment, a question I should say, a comment I might add. Social workers are involved in so many different issues. What I would be interested in hearing is considering the Department of Defense, Armed Services. Being a veteran myself, Operation Iraqi Freedom, I wonder what the panelists would have to say in terms of the complex issues that this protracted war that we find ourselves in, how it's affected social work, and what you see as the road ahead, both academically and as advocates in this profession.
Thank you. Really fast. Who would like to offer an answer?
I work with Give an Hour. Anything you can do, if you're a clinical social worker, we don't have a lot of time to volunteer, and I'm going to be more of an advocate of putting boundaries around your time. But one of the things I do care about is Give an Hour. So if you're an LCSW, you can give 2 hours a week to vets who are on the waiting list. So you can do really specific things as clinical social workers, as well as work on bills, work on things for the VA. I have a really long list, if you want them, of things you can do military-wise, and USC specializes in military social work as well. So I do have resources, I don't know where he went, for you afterwards, but I know we're out of time, so you go.
Well, I was just going to say, your question, if I could, April. So one last thing? Is that right?
Go ahead.
Just a story, it struck me from my past. When I started at the White House, our first meeting was in the Situation Room. And if you've ever looked at the Situation Room, you've got, it's effectively a big conference room, conference table, chairs around the conference table.
Super secret.
And then, super secret, but you've seen pictures. And then there's some chairs that are around the outside of that room. So chairs directly at the table, chairs around the outside of that room. And on our first meeting, we all walked in, and we sat in the seats around the outside of the table. And then the big boss came in and saw all of his appointees sitting around these seats around the outside of the table with no one seated at the table. And he took his seat at the table, and he looked at us, and he said, "What are you waiting for? We have work to do. Take your seat at the table." And I think that that's the message for you is what are you waiting for? We have important work to do. Take your seat at the table, and you don't have to do that alone. That's not alone. You with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family, to go back and sort of flush these ideas out with, but there is important work to do. There are seats at the table, and we need you there.
That's an amazing story. That was an amazing story. Don't sit outside, be at the table. I want to thank you all. This has been an education for me. This was a great panel discussion. I want to thank the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy for inviting me and hosting all of this in this Social Work Month. Thank you so much. Please, my hashtag, my @ handle is April D. Ryan, and I encourage you to be involved. This is a time, for a time such as this, we need to hear voices. And I thank you again, and I'm going to bring Charles Lewis up, and don't forget, I got a book signing right after. And I also want to thank my cousin, the former New York Congressman, the Right Honorable Adolphus Towns. He's my cousin on my mama's side. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, April. Okay, let's give our moderator another great hand. All right. She's an honorary social worker from now on, and so is Jason and Linda, Susan, and let's give them all a good hand.